All of these different factors affect how we can move through the world and how the world interacts with us. Are we seen as trustworthy or not? Are we seen as valuable or not? Is our body considered to be sovereign to us or not? All of these things affect how it can feel to be in a body. As people got more adept at that practice of being in a relationship between their body and the earth, things would change in their lives. They would leave jobs that weren't fulfilling. They would leave relationships that weren't fulfilling.
This is the Lifeiness Podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Clarke. Lifeiness means to take up space and feel present and alive in your body, in your emotions, and in nature, so you can create the most joyful and vibrant life that is possible right now for you. Welcome back to Lifeiness. Today's episode is about feeling at home in your body and all of the obstacles that can get in the way of that feeling. I know that for me, I spent years not listening to signals from my body, whether they were intuitive, emotional messages, or just feeling uncomfortable, or eating certain things that didn't agree, or sitting for too many hours. I squashed them down and ignored them. As many of us know, that can lead to pathology. This isn't any kind of New Age science, nor is it spiritualism. It's simply common sense that if you ignore your body's needs, you become ill. Whether that's overweight or malnourished or just completely stressed out and full of pain. My guest today has a wonderful antidote to all this in her new book, Returning Home to Our Bodies. Her name is Abigail Rose Clarke. Now, as a quick side note, there's a small part of this episode that offers an interesting reflection of and answer to the very first episode of this podcast, in which I spoke candidly about addiction and sobriety and disembodiment. Today, my guest, Abigail Rose Clarke, no relation, theorizes that addiction is simply an expression of not feeling safe within the body, not feeling comfortable, and that an abusive control of our own bodies, a type of relationship that many of us are familiar with, is the opposite of that playful, awe-filled, natural state we're born into. I find this interesting because as I begin to wrap up this first season of Lifeiness, I'm finding answers to questions that were posed almost a year ago when I began this journey. So here, Abigail specifically talks about an eating disorder that she used to have, and she talks about it in the language of addiction. She said it was basically like having an addiction to the comfort of overeating, as well as having an addiction to the imposed control of restricting calories. In recent years, I've witnessed people very close to me, young people, who almost lost their lives from disorders like these. And to think that figuring out how to become comfortable in your body and more playful is one way to combat that brings me some comfort myself. But as Abigail points out, getting comfortable with embodiment is easier said than done. I felt so honored to speak with Abigail because this month a very exciting thing is happening. On January 9th, her book, Returning Home to Our Bodies, will be published and widely available to readers. It's not only a poetic description of how the human body works in symbiosis with the natural world, but it can also serve as a practical companion for caring for your body and making the most of your physical experience. On the book's website, it is described this way: pushing back against a consumerist, pleasure-centric somatics industry that privileges product over process, Abigail Rose Clarke reminds us that truly meaningful embodiment practice nurtures our relationships among self, nature, and community. And it is a wonderful book. So Abigail and I today We talk about privilege and beauty and the extractive nature of Western economies. Extractive not only of the natural world, but of our life force, our time and energy, and our bodies. We talk about the repercussions of ignoring our body's whispers, the discomfort that demands acknowledgement. And it's this intimate understanding that fuels her passion to guide readers back to a harmonious existence. We also talk about how marketing can sometimes single-handedly manipulate us using all of our pain points, and how aging affects the psyche in the Western world especially. Beyond being an author, Abigail's the creator of the Embodied Life Method, a practice that she teaches online and around the world. This somatic learning experience centers the body as a guide through today's social and environmental challenges, reclaiming the body as a source of liberatory comfort. I was so thrilled when I heard from Abigail about her book, because it falls in line so well with the messaging of this podcast, but it also brought me a much greater understanding of somebody who's been working in somatics for years with other people and their bodies and their relationships to their bodies. So as you listen to this episode, remember to mark your calendar for January 9th, and you can find it on Amazon, and you can find more about Abigail on her website in the show notes here, and the Embodied Life Method, and some other of the things that she will talk about in this episode. So without further ado, let's delve into the magic of the Embodied Life Method with our remarkable guest, Abigail Rose Clarke. Thank you so much for being on the Life
thank
Venus
you.
podcast.
Yeah.
Before you even got into somatics, where were you in your own journey?
Well, I first started studying somatics, you could call it, but I entered into the world of somatics through the study of yoga. And that was when I was about 17. I was a teenager. I dropped out of high school. I was doing a lot of protests and activism. So I would say that I entered into this world of the body with that already really firmly in place. And then, my own family and upbringing, I was raised by a single mom, only child of a single mom, who has a very fierce, independent spirit, and also a very strong North Pole when it comes to justice and equality. So I was raised in that sort of intellectual and political upbringing. And then it was moving down here to Mexico. I came down here for the first time about 10 years ago, and first was doing like months at a time and then months away. When the quarantines happened, I ended up staying here for about 3 years straight, which was a really unique and very special experience. Like, it had its frightening aspects, but it was also a really beautiful place to be during that awful time.
Mm-hmm.
But something that I'm fluent in Spanish. I very clearly am not Mexican. So Mexicans know I'm not Mexican. It's really obvious as soon as they hear me speak. They don't typically think that I'm American at first because I don't have an American accent at all. And most Americans down here, for better or worse, are not fluent. So there's like this kind of, you can't possibly be American. But what was really interesting to me is that in living down here and not being recognized as a white American by white American and white Canadian travelers, I did experience some of the insidious ways that racism exists within white Americans and white Canadians, in the ways that they would treat me when they thought that I wasn't white or American, and then how that would switch almost immediately if I spoke to them in English.
Wow.
Yeah, it was enlightening, right, to see it. And that's not to say that everyone is like that, but it's to say that enough people are like that I was like, okay, this is something that that deserves my close attention. And I actually taught for a few years. I taught classes on embodied and somatic approach to understanding whiteness as a lived experience, so that it wasn't just a mental idea. That started in 2016 when the majority of white women voted for Trump. And that continued until I think 2019, when I realized that an unwelcome side effect of teaching the class in that way was that some people would take the class and think that it somehow meant that they had graduated from needing to observe their own whiteness. And I was like, okay, I definitely don't want that. Instead, I make sure that, and I didn't want to keep on centering whiteness at the center of my work just all the time. I wanted instead to make sure that I was always including it in conversations, but at a certain point, it started to feel like whiteness itself was pulling all the energy of the conversation into itself, and I didn't want that. So that gives a bit of a background.
That's great. So you were a rebellious American teen who became a yogi, and it sounds like you were raised in kind of a progressive but waspy household.
Yeah.
With an interesting origin story. So
yeah, and even just the whole, like, my intro to activism was through environmental activism, and then I was thankfully schooled by Black and Indigenous communities in the mostly white area where I grew up about environmental racism, about the tokenism that they were experiencing within these very liberal enclaves of, say, like organic farming, etc. And that was really helpful. And I think that it's also really important to note that my entry point was environmental activism rather than, and then, studying yoga, which I am so grateful for. There's a lot of reckoning to deal with as a white person who studied and taught yoga in the West also, right? So it's another reason why I was like, all right, this practice of being in the body is really so beautiful. I'm never going to pretend like it just somehow dawned on me that all of this is possible. I remember talking with a friend from India, or I should say acquaintance. I met him while traveling, and he was just talking about how, like, he was like, imagine that you go to a room where everyone is singing Jingle Bells out of tune and with the words all wrong and feeling like they're having a spiritual experience in it. That's what kirtan feels like to me. And he was like, oh, okay, that's really interesting. And I want to, like, I think I can do a better job of honoring these incredible teachings by not assuming that I can teach them, right? Yeah. And so instead, acknowledging that I learn things from these incredible teachers that I've been so fortunate to study with, and these practices that have maintained an aliveness through a lot of hardship and also just through a lot of time without making these assumptions like, oh, I know. So, there's a lot of layers. I mean, being a white person in this world means that there's just a consistent grappling going on, or there needs to be, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think just being a Western person.
Yeah, being a Western person for sure. So a Western white person, you're just stacking it up.
Right, for sure. So with that being said, you have all these layers, but then you have your own thing, I think it's your own, called the Embodied Life Method. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So it is my own. It comes, but nothing is ever like truly original. So it comes from a lineage of teachers. My primary teachers are Patty Townsend, who developed a style of yoga called Embody Yoga. And her primary teacher is Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who developed body mind centering. So that's like my somatic mom and my somatic grandma, right? So
got it.
Writing that down. Placing myself in that lineage, the embodied life method is something I have named because I wanted to bring forth that there really is a method to the idea of practicing embodiment and somatics, that it's an art form to be sure, and there's a lot of ways that we are constantly, it's very innovative, but there can be a method to it. And that stemmed from my having gone back to school thinking that I was going to do a degree in physical therapy. So I had to take all of the hard sciences, just really being stammered with this idea of a scientific method that wasn't about ever a dogmatic truth, but just continually moving closer to the truth as it presented itself with a consistent readiness to change one's mind and one's thinking if new evidence presented itself. And I was like, wow, that is so refreshing, right? That's why I called it the Embodied Life Method, wanting to bring forward this idea that there is a method and we don't have to get dogmatic in our approach, but we can be methodical in it. So I've been teaching that for,
Yeah.
it's about 10 years that I've been teaching that under that name. But it came about
Wow.
and it came about as a result of in teaching yoga and in teaching specifically in body yoga, that style of yoga that was developed by Patty Townsend, which is very relational rather than positional. A lot of Western yoga in particular focuses on what the position the body is in. So move your shoulder like this, move your arm like your leg like that, place your foot like that. And there's value to that. But Patty's style of yoga is very relational in the sense that you are in a relationship between the earth and your own body and then gravity. And to find the alignment of any pose, you are looking to see how you can essentially get yourself out of the way so that the forces of gravity can move through you in a relational flow. And that doesn't require that you have the flexibility or the mobility to be able to put your leg behind your head. So in teaching that, by the time I became a senior teacher of that style. And in teaching that, what I was able to see was that as people got more adept at that practice of being in a relationship between their body and the earth, things would change in their lives. They would leave jobs that weren't fulfilling. They would leave relationships that weren't fulfilling. They'd start school for another career track that felt more aligned with what they wanted to do. They'd find comfort in being single, or they'd find a relationship that felt better. There would be changes that would happen that people kept on attributing to this sense of support and buoyancy that they had in their own body that was different than this feeling of like, oh, I need to do these shapes right. I mean, yoga's like people get incredible healing from yoga. I don't mean to imply that somehow they're not receiving that. But what I was seeing is that it wasn't just about the shapes or the breath even. It was about the relational flow between the body and the earth. And so that's why I started teaching this, calling it the embodied life method. And then you're a professor, so as you teach something, it shapes as you, and then it changes as you go. So that's been an unfolding.
It sounds like it's truly physical therapy in the sense that, in contrast to talk therapy, which talk therapy is what we typically think of when we get psychological help and support for our lives. You're doing that in a physical way, which sounds amazing, where people are making changes based on something they're doing physically, which I think must be so gratifying. And I wonder, so who are your clients? Where did you find your community? Is it mostly in Mexico?
Well, I started teaching online in 2013, actually, like in the era of Skype. So these drop connections that we're experiencing, like nothing new in that way. Just talk about frustrating, clunky technology. I was teaching with Zoom way before the quarantine started. I used to have to tell people what Zoom was and encourage them to download it. And no, it's okay. You'll see it works. Which is funny now that Zoom has become a verb in our culture like Xerox or Google, right? It's just what it is. So, and that was how I was able to be down here for as long as if I come down here. Right now I'm here for a month and I'm still working, and I've been down here for 6 months or even like during the quarantines, and was able to continue working. So I feel really grateful for the technology. And so, I do have some people who I work with down here in Mexico for sure. And then Australia, Europe, South America, Canada. The States tends to be where most people come find me from because I'm an American. So at the end of that's the culture I know best. So it's the culture I feel most comfortable speaking towards, right? And so look at this and how we could possibly choose something different. And it's funny when you sent those questions, which thank you, by the way, for such thoughtful questions. I was like, oh yeah, this is an English professor. This is great.
Did my research.
Yeah, I was like, wow, this is really solid. So thank you so much. Good, but thank you. Yeah. When I saw that you were asking me that, I was just laughing because I have spent a lot of time and money with like business coaches and business advisors to try and like do that thing where you niche down into like, who do you work for? Like, do you work with teachers? Do you work with artists? Do you work with this? Do you work with that? And it was never really, I couldn't really figure it out because I was just like, I have so many different kinds of people. Like, really? So many different kinds of people. Most of the people I work with are adults in their But sometimes that can range from young adults through to senior citizens. So it's not like I can just tell you, oh yeah, I work with people, age 20 to 30. No, really the only thing that I ask of people who want to work with me is that that curiosity is something that drives them, and that a willingness to explore, and just like the scientific method asks of us, a willing to let presumptions fall away as we go. That's really all I'm asking of people. I make sure that my work as a somatic practitioner, I make sure that my work does not assume certain mobility, because I have people who work with me who have very limited mobility. I make sure not to assume English is the first language, and definitely not that jargon is an understood idea.
Yeah.
I try and make my work as accessible as possible, which is all these business coaches and business advisors would be like, oh no, that's not going to work because then you're too much for everyone. But somehow my people keep on finding me. So I'm just going to keep on going that way.
Wonder, how do they find you?
Yeah. Most people find me through things like Instagram. I'm pretty active. Of all the social media profiles, that's what I'm the most active on. Word of mouth, for sure. I do a lot of writing, and so I publish on Medium and Substack, and people have found me that way. One of my better known and most beloved creations is called the Somatic Tarot. And that deck has woven an incredible web of just going out into the world and finding people who then find me. So yeah, and now I'm so excited for this book to be in the world because I love it. But also, books are such an interesting technology because they require a lot of alone time. Right? Like you're just you and your computer. There you are.
Yep. It is.
And it's this strange experience of being in essentially a unilateral conversation and having to intuit what someone's questions might be, right? In order to write a really take someone through the journey with you. But then once it goes out, and this is why books are a technology, even though we think of technology and gadgets, books are a technology in the way that it allows these conversations to now it's like a seed. So I feel like the seed pod is close to bursting and it's about to just go out into the world. And I am so excited to start in conversations with people to get to see how these ideas and practices are going to germinate within the minds and bodies of other people is really exciting to me.
I really appreciate that scientific method coupled with your beautiful poetic style of writing. And the topic, like I said, is just something I'm so interested in. And I want to read just a few lines because it is so beautiful. I want listeners to hear those words.
Yeah.
You say, it's beautiful to learn certain movements and practices that help our own bodies ache a little less, sleep a little better, and feel a little more ease in our own skin. We deserve to feel ease and comfort in our own bodies. When I read this line, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the purpose of my podcast, simply to help listeners to relax. And I thought it was kind of a simple idea, a humble idea, but I realized it's a very radical practice. And I'm starting to learn how difficult it can be for some people versus others. So I wonder, how do you come across not sounding like a wellness savior? Not, as you say, it's easy to get caught up in this grandiosity. You do this. Navigate this space?
That's such a great question. I do want to say that it's a practice. I am practicing it. And this is something I really credit Patty Townsend, the person who I consider my foremost teacher in the world of somatics. She would always encourage us to make sure that we were actively stepping down from any pedestal that we might ever get put upon as a yoga teacher, because there's such a tendency towards that. I am floating into the room vibe.
Right.
And she would be like, no, you have to be the biggest bozo in the room because you're the one that's in front of everyone. And so one thing that I try and hold really central is a willingness to be wrong. Through the combination of proclivities and privileges, I've had time to obsessively study, right? I say it in the book that there's a lot of things I'm wrong about, definitely in life, but probably in this book. I want to make sure that I'm not proclaiming myself as some sort of expert. And I say it's a practice because I definitely get it wrong sometimes. I mean, I'm judgmental. I make assumptions all the time. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, because I don't want anyone who knows me to listen to this and be like, she said that? Like she said, no, like I try and keep myself really honest here. But I think that by remaining in a practice and remembering that I too am continually becoming, I am continually unfolding in this. And I would never want to be in a position of having placed myself as on such a high pedestal that now I don't get to learn from you, right? So that is also, part of that practice of not being in the like wellness savior positioning.
So a related question. I mean, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I do love I love your phrasing. Yeah, I think it's called subtle navigation in the book. You say there's no removing a body from the context in which the body lives. And yet, when the study of somatics is commoditized within the greater embodiment and mindfulness industries, the practice of turning to our own felt embodied sensations often approaches the study of the body from a perspective of exclusively learning how to make the body better. This is a lot, but I think this is so important. The commodity of relaxation and just somatics at some that you say it becomes extractive. What do you mean by that? Like, tell me a little bit more about how feeling at home in our own skin can be this gift that some of us are given and some are not.
I think it's a gift that all of us are given, but then some of us have it taken from us.
Yeah.
So, and that's why in another part of the book, I know that you mentioned it in the email that we shared. I was talking about watching a baby experience that they have feet for the first time and that like awe and excitement that they have with it, or just like, I mean, I'm not a parent, but the sound of a baby giggling is just such a good sound, right? Because it's such pure and happiness at being in a body with the people that you love, right?
Right.
But then through different social systems and then also through different individual experiences, which are not unrelated, some of us are taught that it's not safe to be in our bodies, right? And so you have to think, there's a term, the kyriarchy, which is the intersecting privileges and how they intersect and relate, like a prism, not prison, but it is a prison for some of us. So if you think of how and gender and sexuality and physical attractiveness and age and able-bodiedness and all of these different factors affect how we can move through the world and how the world interacts with us. Are we seen as trustworthy or not? Are we seen as valuable or not? Is our body considered to be sovereign to us or not? All of these things affect how it can feel to be in a body. And in grappling with that, this is why I think that we have to, especially those of us who are in the wellness space as wellness practitioners and teachers, we have to grapple with that because it just won't, it's not going to ever be enough for me as a white Western woman to tell somebody who's experiencing systemic oppression that I could barely even fathom, that all they have to do is just breathe and they'll be okay, right? That's just...
Right.
I have removed myself so completely from any conversation of value if I state that, right? And that doesn't mean that breathing and finding gravity and ground and the support of the body on the earth can't be a helpful practice for anyone, for everyone, but it's just not going to be enough if I'm like, oh no, all you have to do is just breathe and you'll be okay, right?
Right.
Yeah, without wanting to get too far into the weeds, I think that's why I name that as being so important that we hold in our explorations of this, that we hold privileges as part of the exploration and the conversation. It doesn't really have to be the hyper focus, like we're only going to talk about this the whole time, right? So that's the only thing we ever talk about. Well, we do need to be ready to talk about at any time.
So what do you think specifically? How do you think that capitalism forces us sometimes to not feel at home in our own skin? I mean, like, what are just some of the forces that are at play?
Okay. Just a little side note, as an English teacher, have you ever read the book Momo by Michael Ende?
Haven't.
Okay, so he's the author of Neverending Story, right?
What?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, go.
This is an interesting
Yep.
connection. Okay.
So that is the book I have given away more than any other. It is the book that I try and make sure I read at least once a year. I love this book so much, and it really, I think that it's written for young adults, right? It's not like this heavy academic tome, but he, in such a spectacular way, the ways in which capitalism requires an extraction of joy from people, right?
Wow.
So I don't want to give anywhere away, but go get it.
I will.
Yeah, it's such a good book. Oh my gosh. So capitalism, and I call it extractive capitalism in my work because I want to really hold that as a focus. And also because I find that, for better or worse, sometimes people make a wrong assumption that trades and markets are somehow uniquely the territory of capitalism, but that's not true. Trades, markets, bartering, all of that, it has precedent to what this system that we call capitalism is, right?
Right.
But capitalism requires extraction in the form of time and essentially life force from its workers, in the form of minerals and other natural resources. And we can, right now we're talking about that in terms of cobalt for computers like the ones that we're using right now to have this conversation. But if you read a book like Open Veins of Latin America by Galeano, which is another book that I really recommend, he talks about how sugar, as a very nutrient-hungry crop that was worth, in that era of I think it was the 1800s, millions of dollars. In that era, it's very nutrient-hungry, so it was literally extracting minerals from the very soil as well as human life. So capitalism has always required an extraction in the form of human life and natural. We call them resources, but that right there shows how we've been taught to think of them as something that is just waiting to be used by us, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, but then I remembered in a sociology class that I took years ago, many years ago, they were talking about advertising. And now, as somebody who, as somebody who works for themselves, I've had to learn marketing and advertising in order to be able to share what I do. And so much of the ways that people teach advertising is rooted in these what's called pain points, right? And it's not to say that you can't do that in a way that acknowledges someone's sovereignty. I think that there is actually really beautiful ways where you can say, hey, what I always try and do in my own work is say, hey, we're in this thing together. Are you seeing this? You understand that this is happening, right? Because I think that there's something really powerful when you see somebody else say, this isn't okay, right? But the way that it's classically taught in marketing and advertising is that to figure out people's pain points, feeling lonely, feeling unloved, and rather than addressing the systemic issues that make people feel lonely and alone, lonely and unlovable, which things the third space, right? And Momo does a really great job of describing this too, of how there used to be these you go other countries and see that there are these vibrant spaces where people gather that is not home, right? Or school or work.
Public space,
Yeah, and America has lost a lot of that, right? It used to be the shopping mall, and now even those are going extinct. So it's there's no space where you don't have to be on in the sense of work or school, but you also don't have to be alone.
Mm-hmm.
I've read some people talking about how the internet is now our third space, right? Yeah. But even that, you're still always getting sold something.
So what do you think is being extracted in terms of let's just say the female body?
The female body? Okay. And I want to say that let's say the feminine as a gender, right? And because I also want to say trans women don't feel like they're excluded from this conversation at all. Well, I turned 40 about a year ago. I'll be 41 really soon. And I was a little bit shocked and a bit chagrined to notice how much of a thing that was for me as I led up to it. Yeah. A changing body, a changing face, some gray hairs, and also this feeling of like, well, but if I don't have youthful beauty to offer, what am I offering?
Right.
It was this like I had to really grapple with it, and I still am now as somebody who's like truly in their 40s, just grappling with what that means. So I think that,
Right.
and I say that knowing that I am not alone in that. That in fact it's a really just common
Right.
thing that as women in this world that prioritizes youth, and that youth and beauty are what we are expected to maintain and produce, right? Like
Right.
anti-aging and all this stuff.
Right.
So that rather than, and I was just in a radio interview here in Mexico where we were talking about how the difference between being in like realizing that you have a body that is meant to feel and feeling like you have a body that is meant to be perceived, right? So this is not something that is
Yeah.
exclusive to women, but it is something that is very specifically placed upon us as women, that we are supposed to be smile, right? Attain a certain shape, a certain look, a certain this, a certain that, and that not only is that expected, but it is punished if it is not maintained. Not necessarily in overt ways, right? We thankfully don't live in a society where women are publicly punished for not maintaining it in a certain way, but in another way they are. Also just the privileges that come with having a youthful, attractive body, right? We are expected to produce beauty and youth, and if we don't, we are punished for it. So I think that's important to keep in our conversation, not to like feel like we are now constantly crushed under its weight, but because something I've seen and I've experienced is this feeling of like last year I was just like, what is my problem? I'm a feminist. I don't care. Like but if I didn't then pause to be like, yeah, but it's not just about how I feel. It's about like I will need to grapple with how the ways that society treats me will be changing. Stopped it. It took it away from being like just a me problem where like somehow I'm a bad feminist to being like, I'm now learning something more about how femininity is expected to perform.
Right. Yeah. So perhaps what it takes from women or just from the feminine is the ability to feel into our bodies and to have to enjoy the sensations and the feelings versus being perceived.
Yeah.
Right. Putting the priority on the way that we're seen rather than us being able to enjoy the sensation.
Yeah. It's pretty rare that I get to truly feel like I'm not being perceived. Right. I don't know about you.
Right.
Pretty rare.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm 47, and I'll tell you, like, I always tell people, like, my 20s were definitely the worst decade of my life.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Things got way better somewhere in the mid-30s.
Was it? Yeah,
and, like,
same.
40s are pretty good, too. So it's like, as long as I'm staying in touch with what I'm feeling on the inside and what I'm enjoying, and a lot of times that perception thing, I don't know, you see it differently as you get older.
Yeah.
And it's not as bad as, like, maybe you perceived it as a 20-year-old because we're all in this culture together.
Yeah.
And so we all have these assumptions and they do change once you actually experience it. But yeah, I try to prioritize the way that I experience things on the inside, which is why I'm so into this kind of movement of feeling more embodied, feeling more relaxed, and feeling more playful, actually. I think that's important.
Absolutely.
I did really want to get to this question about disembodiment and addiction. If you have anything to say about this, because I think there is a connection there. And it probably even goes along with the topic that we're talking about right now, with feeling disembodied as a woman.
So I think it was Gabor Mate who said that not every traumatized person will become an addict, but every addict will have experienced trauma. I think that's an important thing to remember when we think about addiction and disembodiment. I had an eating disorder when I was younger, and it was a combination of being addicted to both the comfort of eating and then also the comfort of this imposed control. And so in healing that, which I feel really grateful that I no longer have an eating disorder, but as we were just talking about, I'm a Western woman, and so there are aspects of unhooking myself from a culture that tells me that I'm only valuable if I look a certain way, that will just be a continual a continual practice for me, I think. And so in thinking about addiction in any kind, right? Addiction of any kind, we tend to vilify some and exemplify others, right? Like an addiction to working out is seen as like, oh, you're a good person with a lot of willpower, but an addiction to hard drugs, you're an awful person, right?
Right.
But any behavior that pulls us away from ourselves is really, I try and hold softness around it, that it is us trying our best, right? To do something that finds some sort of comfort. So, yeah, I would say that, and I'm not a therapist, so I don't want to, or a mental health practitioner, so I don't want to like overstep, but I would say that it feels pretty safe to say that addiction is a result of not finding safety within the body. You don't find it within the body, so you have to reach out to something else to find it. And that it makes all the sense in the world to feel that way in a world that prioritizes extracting from us and making us feel less comfortable in ourselves so that we have to go buy something else.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a really hard and...
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. Just feeling like, and I think you mentioning eating addiction, they're pretty much the same thing. And that obsessive compulsive type of response that you have as a traumatized body, and kind of like separating the self from the body and being able to dominate or control. So I'm glad we got to that. And I wanted to talk about the last question because I wanted to get to the romantic body. And I love this section. And you talk about this deep love for nature and our bodies, almost like a romance. And you say it's impossible to love our bodies if we have a relationship of abusive control over them. Which is a good segue from what we just talked about, that having that abusive control seems normal in our world in a lot of ways. We're born with an inherent and playful awe of the body. So how do you think, for listeners, like how can we get back to that playful, that awe-filled, like comfortable nature with the body that babies have and small children have?
Yeah. I feel really fortunate. I mentioned at the beginning of our talk that I'm here visiting my goddaughter, who's 7 now, and I mentioned her in the book the book is dedicated to her, actually, because as a teacher of just being in awe as the most natural thing, she has gratefully made sense of awe and magic, at least into 7, and I'm hoping forever. So I feel really fortunate that when I wonder how to find my own sense of awe, I can just think about her, right? Yeah. But I do think, those of us who are lucky enough to live with children, whether they're our own or others, that really is a gift that children offer us. They are just beacons of what it means to be in awe of the world, right? But so I think what we can do is give ourselves, talking about playfulness, to give ourselves permission to play, to be excited and in awe of the natural world around us, to get down in the dirt and look at bugs, to go be in awe of the world in the ways that hopefully we all got to as children. But even if you didn't get to as a child for a tragic reason, to go out there now. And that doesn't mean that you have to, if you're lucky in the middle of a natural setting, then that it might be a little bit easier. But no matter where you are, there's something is nature is happening, right? And seek it out. Again, this is one of the reasons, like, when you read Momo, you'll see why I love it so much. But to seek out that depth of tension that pulls us into, Indigenous seed keeper Rowan White calls it a reverent curiosity. Doing that really does, for me, and I've seen it work for others, it pulls us out of the mental despair that anyone who's paying attention is going to feel right now, right? And so this is not to then pretend like what's happening does not matter, but it is hopefully to offer a counterpoint that awful things are happening, and look at that flower, look at the light and the wind, look at this, look at that, right? That it's all happening.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you have a quote at the beginning of the book about how we are nature. I can't remember the author, but basically we are nature. So when we do get to like sit with a kitten that's playing, it's so lovely because that's who we are really. When we get to sit near a tree, we are that, right? But we forget.
Yeah, the quote is don't imitate the natural, be nature. And it's by Martine Prechtel.
Yes, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So, Abigail, your book is coming out.
Yeah,
it's so exciting.
It is really exciting.
Yeah. And what do you anticipate? What are you doing in the next year or two? Are you changing things? Are you going to be speaking? What's on the horizon, Clarke?
Yeah, I am really looking forward to events that I've planned. I haven't planned them out into 2025 yet, but I am planning them out into 2024. The book opening party is going to be in Olympia, Washington, and then I'll be in Seattle and Portland in the month of January to do some in-person events. I'll be doing a lot of virtual events also. As I was saying earlier, I'm excited to see what happens as a result of this book being out in the world. I feel like it is arriving at a time that people are really hungry for it. So that makes me I feel like I'm just going to be really excited to see this creation go out and have a life of its own. But I will be traveling quite a lot through the States and Mexico and Canada and hopefully elsewhere as well to share with people about this book. I also teach every week. I've been teaching for about 5 years online in a group called Anchor Community, and I'll keep doing that because I love it and it literally anchors me. And that's open for people if they're curious about it. When I'm touring to do these different book events, I'll be doing some readings at independent bookstores, which I'm really excited about because I love independent bookstores so much. But as I'm in each city, I'm teaching some workshops on the embodied life method and specifically the growl method that I share in this book so that I see these ideas really come to life with people as a way of approaching conflict and just the challenges of being alive right now. And I see where those conversations take me as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations for finishing such a beautiful
book. Thank you so much.
And thank you for writing it.
Yeah.
And I assume that listeners can find it on Amazon, but I'll make sure that we have it at our independent bookstore here in Jacksonville, Florida.
Fun. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Maybe I'll come down to Florida to see you. Yeah. It is distributed through Penguin Random House, which means that it is literally available anywhere books are sold. They do a great job. So yeah, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the big guys, but then also any independent bookstore can get it. And if you go and ask them to get it, that's great. Or ask your local library to carry it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you.
Good luck. And congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.